What if the real reason you're stuck isn't emotional? It's physical. Today's conversation is going to shift the way you see trauma healing in your own body. I'm sitting down with Holly, a physician's assistant with over 20 years of experience, for her second appearance on the show. And this time, we're going to go deeper. We're talking about what trauma actually does to our nervous system, why gut health is deeply connected to our emotional healing, and how silence, shame, and survival show up in your body long after the event is over. If you're feeling stuck, exhausted, this episode will explain why, and more importantly, what to do next. Let's dive into it. You can't change what you don't acknowledge. What do you think made it hard for you to speak up in those 15 years of silence?
The pain, absolutely, no doubt. The pain that I carried every day. I didn't want anybody else to feel that pain. The only way that I knew, the only solution in my brain at that time was just to hold it tight and protect it at all costs, unfortunately.
Yeah.
Because there's so much pain that goes with emotional pain, tremendous emotional pain. I suffered more emotional pain than physical pain. And then the shame that goes with the fact that you, in so many words, once you stay in an abusive environment, you're kind of allowing for that to occur. So there was a lot of shame that surrounded it. And for those reasons, I chose to remain silent. I think that I didn't feel like that anybody would believe me. At a certain point, you don't feel like anybody will believe anything that you say. There's so much powerful manipulation that takes place so that at a certain point, you don't really have the control over your everyday thoughts, emotions, or decisions. And so at a certain point, you're trapped. You're basically learning to survive at that point in your scenario. Once you spend a certain portion of your time in that, then your body doesn't have the chance to go into what we call rest and digest. And at that point, the physical manifestations can really take place, everything from emotional dysregulation to GI and gut disorders. And once you spend a certain amount of time in sympathetic overdrive, your body tends to kind of go into a shutdown phase where after a period of time, you oscillate back and forth between hypervigilance and then probably more of a shutdown phase where you lack motivation or any desire to try to escape your surroundings.
We talked about 15 years of you staying in silence in a emotionally and domestic violence situation. And I'm excited to have you back in a part 2 that really helps somebody break the silence, right? And really create a plan to get out of that feeling of stuck and silence, to help somebody this time create kind of that roadmap and then help us understand, like, when we're in it, what is our body saying to us? What is our mind saying to us? What's our gut saying to us during that time that we might not actually even realize it while it's happening? But then we know now in our 40s and 50s, wow, mentally, physically, emotionally, all that stress played such a factor in the effects of our health later in life. And we really don't see that until we kind of get to this age because we're in survival mode. In our first episode, one of the things was like to help somebody feel like they could talk about it and not basically carry this for their lifetime. Find someone, speak it, get, it's the freedom, right? After an abuse, you feel like you feel very alone.
And I think that's the biggest thing that when I self-reflect, that I would tell anybody that is sitting there questioning to themselves, what should I do? Or what's the first thing I could do? It's break your silence. I was so afraid to break my silence for so many reasons, probably for self-protection, protecting my abuser that I had a trauma bond with, probably made absolutely no sense to anybody. But breaking the silence is the most important first step in being able to release your mind and body of everything that you've held for so long.
Breaking the silence isn't about the trauma. It's the truth, right? Speaking that truth and having that freedom once you have actually spoken it to someone. So once you acknowledge that and you speak the truth, to me, that's the journey forward and you can actually really start healing.
Absolutely. We spoke about that during my first podcast that I trained and worked as a PA I've worked as a PA now for over 20 years. I truly believe that the privacy that goes with the position that you hold in the medical profession lended, I guess, an additional layer of fear. It was about protecting myself. And when I would go into my work environment, I held too much pain and shame to be able to talk to anybody. And so holding it in silence, working in the medical profession for me was really the only logical decision at the time. I feared so many things. I feared my abuser coming back and finding me if I ever spoke. Initially, probably that's the initial fear that kept me silent, because they tell you to be silent. And sometimes they directly tell you and sometimes indirectly. So initially that probably led me to silence. But then going into the clinic every day and taking care of my patients, it did not allow for me to think beyond that when I was at work. So I really had to almost come to work, and honestly, it was almost like a second identity, right? You come to work and that was my safe place where I could be safe physically, but also emotionally safe. I worked at the clinic at the time for over 15 years. And so they were like my second family. And that probably factored in too. They were my family. It was very difficult. I suppose if I ever had thoughts or feelings, which I'm sure I did, of sharing anything, the shame and the guilt would filter in and not allow me to ever fully disclose what was happening, unfortunately.
Well, and that's what I think makes it hard for a lot of people, of the silence part, acknowledging that, you allowed yourself not only to get into the situation,
but to stay and to allow it to continue.
Yeah. When you were in silence, did you notice your body or anything happening during that time? And then I also want to talk about not only your body, but then relationships, because, what happened with relationships when you're in an abusive relationship? Because one of the things we talk about with silence is, who do we talk to? Because a lot of times when you are in abusive relationships, they eliminate your friendships and relationships outside of them.
Yes.
So you don't have necessarily a person, which we'll talk about. But so twofold. One was your body. Did you notice anything? Or was that later, we're now in your, early 50s, you can say, oh my gosh, I realized, this was happening during that time?
We would probably have to reflect back a little bit and just remember that my trauma started at the age of 14. My body started showing physical symptoms by the time I was 20. Now that I can reflect back, I was an avid runner. And I can remember now a lot of the physical complaints that I didn't understand back then. Muscle weakness, fatigue in my muscles, shortness of breath, hypoglycemia type feelings were really all dysregulations of my nervous system that I just didn't understand at the time. I can think back to when I was about 20 or 25 and started feeling physical symptoms. Once I had introduced myself, unfortunately, into that abusive relationship, after probably 2 to 3 years, I started having physical complaints. Things like intense anxiety, GI issues. So I had a lot of motility issues, heartburn. I developed food intolerances that just kind of emerged, if you will, to episodes sometimes where my nervous system would probably shut down, go into that shutdown phase, and my GI tract would shut down. And then I wouldn't be able to eat or even move food through my GI tract. And so the myriad of physical symptoms will evolve the longer that a person stays in an emotionally or physically abusive environment, because the body no longer has the ability to shift between a parasympathetic or relaxed state and to a sympathetic alert state. And many times the body spends a portion of its time in sympathetic overdrive at that point. And then at that point, any of your body's functions, rest and digest type functions, so sleep, emotional regulation, and digestion are typically significantly impacted at that point. And those people will develop things like anxiety, depression, GI disturbances, motility issues, infections, immune dysregulation, to cardiovascular complications to include high blood pressure, things like that. So the list goes on. The list is really relentless. And I think a lot of people that live, that could identify and relate, would probably check the box to every single thing I listed and say, yes, that's me.
It's interesting listening to you talk about all those symptoms. And I think the unfortunate part is we learn that later.
Yes.
where I think if somebody could do it now, that's why it's so important. Just listening to you of getting out of that sooner than later, those relationships that are like that, because the impact on your body of kicking you into like an autoimmune disease because of stress and cortisone
Yes.
and all of that into your gut, you become pretty sick in your 40s.
You definitely
Yeah.
do. And that's why I would tell anybody that breaking your silence and freeing yourself of an abusive scenario will save you physically and emotionally in the long term.
Yeah.
I mean, you can rescue yourself. That's
Yeah.
the greatest thing. You can
Yeah.
actually rescue yourself. Once you have the tools and a little knowledge to understand the physical symptoms that you're living with. Most people that live with PTSD from an abusive relationship have a myriad of physical symptoms that oftentimes leads them onto things like autoimmune disorders if they don't get their nervous system under control.
Yeah. Going through a divorce later in life where, I felt sick for 3 years with
Yes.
inflammation. And then I did blood work. And we all have autoimmune diseases. Whether they get triggered by something is an unknown. But when you're not, I know I wasn't sleeping, I wasn't eating, it can kick all of those things. And it's so important, which we'll talk about, to get the mind and the body, what we're eating and what we're thinking about under control, in our nervous system. The same with the relationships. What do you do with the relationships part of it? Because the reality is most of the time you're in those situations, you can't have relationships outside of the person you're with. What would you say to that, I guess, when you talk about breaking the silence? Because who do they talk to?
I think about that a lot because that was me. Now, I was the girl who, and I probably told you this in my very first podcast, I was the one that wanted to be rescued. I waited for my rescuer. And I think because I worked in the medical profession, I had a few close friends, but you do find yourself with many times a very little support group around you because your abuser creates that. They make certain that you're isolated from your family and they create the network of people that you're allowed to be around. Point blank. That's just really how it is, like it or not. And so for me, I have a couple of friends that I could have talked to. I think that I chose not to protect myself and to protect other people from the pain. And so I think for me, if I was to go back and tell that girl that was 29, I would say, you need to tell that friend. You need to ask them for help, even if it's just that one person.
What was your biggest fear? You said you kind of had a relationship, we're a couple friends, you chose not to. And I think of breaking the silence with somebody who's struggling. How do you overcome that feeling of like, I want to tell someone, I don't know if they'll believe me. You're thinking always worst case scenario of what's going to happen. How do you think you push through breaking the silence
Yes.
and actually confronting at least one person?
So in the relationship, when I was still living with him and I was in the relationship, whenever I was driven to want to really tell somebody, the power that he had over me was always much stronger, meaning I would play out that scenario in my mind. Like if I tell my friend and this really goes into play and they help me escape, do I really want to escape? Because you're afraid of everything. You're afraid of even losing that person because they have so much control over you and they have made you believe that you can't make decisions without them, that you can't live without them. And you do truly believe that. A lot of it, right, is being able to look in the mirror and be able to face yourself in the mirror during this process of trying to find some release and find that safe person to talk to. You still have to face yourself in the mirror. And a lot of that is what holds you back, right? How you feel about yourself for allowing yourself to be in this scenario.
I mean, you lack so much self-love at this point. It goes back to think of shame of how did I get myself in this situation?
They're telling you every day, nearly every day, you are told you're not pretty enough, you're not good enough, your body's not good enough, and you believe it after a while.
We'll go into that because that's part of the escape plan. Did you ever feel like it was too late to say something?
Absolutely.
Yeah. I put myself in my own abusive
Because
situation.
look, after a while, even though my close circle of friends was small, after a while, I was ashamed sometimes to be around them because I'm sure I thought to myself, why would they even want to be around me? They know I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to maybe complain or talk about like some of the bad things that happen, that I'll go back. So after a while, there's too much shame. You hold too much shame. I mean, even after I escaped, I still wanted to go back and make him happy, right? So you stay in it because you want to make him better.
Yeah.
You want to make them happy and fix them so that they will sign up for the love that you tried to give them
Yeah.
until we truly, truly break free. And sometimes a lot of that comes from over time, you learn to despise that person that continually hurts you.
I know in my own experience, I spoke up right away. And then I think after no one believed me, then I went back into a state of silence. And then I went back out of that by breaking silence in my 20s. And not that I confronted the abuser, but I was open about it because my thing was like, it's not too late to speak up and hopefully it doesn't happen to someone else. Did you ever think you were actually going to speak about it? Yeah.
No.
You just thought this was my life and it was a part that was just going to close that chapter.
Once I escaped and moved on, I suppressed it for 15 years and attempted to really just move on until the emotional and physical manifestations took over. And then I had to address it. And then what happens is, again, you spend a good portion of your time ruminating over everything. Your body continues to stay in a chronically inflamed state. And then over time, the emotional dysregulation really sets in. And for me, a combination of everything, but I think I briefly touched on this on our part 1 podcast, was that the panic attacks were really the big identifier for me that my body was not able to handle the stress that I was used to being able to handle, and really address my myriad of physical issues that were going on.
That was my first kind of awakening. Was I was having panic attacks and I started having anxiety, and I had never had it my entire life, and I didn't stress about anything. And I still didn't, I would say I almost still didn't feel like I was stressing, but my body was definitely saying I was, through panic attacks, through anxiety, feeling like I, had a heart attack 3 times, getting an EKG.
Yes.
I was like, okay, something's going on.
We've all been to the same specialist.
Yeah, probably right.
Yes.
It's like, how many times are you going to come in to get an EKG? So what shifted when you talked to someone, and who was that?
Yes. So once I was able to get my physical health better to the point where I felt physically stronger and able to feel better from day to day, that gave me the drive to want to work through the emotional aspects of what was happening. So I started some therapy, and really just kind of basic talk therapy. It seemed to work the best for me. I found that some of the other therapies were too complex for my brain. It flooded my emotions, and I wasn't able to make any real progress in therapy. But if I sat down and just did basic talk therapy and started talking about some of the things that brought me to see her, then I was able to start feeling better about getting some of those things out in the open for discussion. And I started to make the connection that my physical symptoms started to diminish, and I started feeling better the more I talked about the emotional aspects of my life. And that's when she brought me all the way back to my childhood, which thankfully allowed me to really go back and build that timeline so that I could kind of do a full emotional release. It was really pretty amazing. And it just continues to build once you allow yourself a little freedom to share.
It's interesting. You had the domestic and emotionally abusive relationship for 10 years and silence again for 15. I know you talked about how you thought you had this great childhood, how now when you were in that therapy, how that shifted to realize my trauma wasn't just the situation here that I thought it was. It was actually way back in a good child or great childhood that you would have considered, and how you could see the kind of the connection and the shift in your body once you started actually, talking about it and reliving it. That's why I think part of it too, of telling someone and talking about not just that scenario, but like, how did you get there?
And it was so super empowering to be able It's very hard to go back. None of us really want to go back. I was very resistant to go back. And I think that was my one-liner, was that I had a great childhood. But once we went back and really discovered everything in my childhood, it really helped me make the connections that I needed to make to understand why my path led me to where I am today.
Yeah.
And I think we spend so much time maybe glancing in the mirror and wondering why? Why me? Why me? And when you go back and retrace your steps with a therapist, it's super empowering. And I think the validation was what helped me feel that physical shift in my nervous system.
I think once you acknowledge that, to me, that breaking the silence, acknowledging it, that had happened, and then I think you start that healing journey forward.
You do. And it's wonderful because it's allowed me to be able to go back and validate. We hold so much shame and guilt for, even though many of those things maybe were completely out of our control. But by going back and tracing my steps, it's allowed me to actually love the little girl that I never loved. And it'll really help you free yourself to love yourself so that you're not sitting there waiting for somebody to come rescue you. And it's nice to be able to sit in a place where you can smile and say that I actually rescued myself. And I want to help other people see that they can do it too, that you don't need to wait on somebody to come and rescue you. I think a lot of times we sit and look around us knowing that a lot of the people that are in our social group at the time, they see it. They see the abuse. A lot of people turn the other way out of extreme uncomfortableness. I think that being able to free yourself of that really frees yourself of all of those feelings that you were trapped for so long.
What I've realized now, talking to more people too, it's not even just sometimes other people being uncomfortable, but I also think that a lot of people have experienced something, so they don't even know what to say. Because I could step back and see your abuse, and I've had my own. So it's not a matter of not wanting to speak up. I've lived my own. And I think that's part of it too. Of
For sure.
what advice do you have for someone who wants to speak up but feels frozen by the fear and the shame and really that confusion?
Again, I will go back and tell anybody, you have to find that one person that you feel comfortable talking to, whether that's your medical provider, whether that's a family member. You have to have that person. You have to start building a support team around you, whether people want to realize it or not. We spend a lot of time in isolation and we become very comfortable in isolation. That becomes our comfort zone. But we have to break that, and you have to develop a team of support so you can effectively break free. It's not that you can't, but it took me a very long time to break free on my own. And I ended up with a myriad of medical complications once I did. And now that I reflect back, you can save yourself a lot of time, a lot of health issues, and give yourself freedom.
Yeah, really just finding that one person.
Honestly, it's just finding that one person.
Yeah.
I had that person, but I never reached out and said, please help me get out. I never said that. You have to say that. We live in so much pain, right? Every day in silence. Is the pain that we live in silence really worth it? And I would say to anybody, maybe just finding that support person that you can say, hey, obviously, you know, I'm in a tough relationship. It hurts and I'm struggling. And there's so many days that I want to run and get out, but I'm afraid. And there's days that I do feel safe or feel good. It's a struggle. I need help. I don't know what to do, but I'm struggling. And I think even if it's just a conversation like that, because I think for me, I always felt the pressure of, well, wonder if I really tell somebody and they really help me get out, but then he comes to find me, or I'm not strong enough on my own. Those were the two common themes in my brain that really held me back. So it was me holding myself back most of the time. When you sit in silence and isolation, it's the worst place you can be. And then your nervous system completely withdraws. It goes into that withdrawal, shutdown, freeze phase where your body has zero motivation. You can't make any decisions. I spent a very long time in that phase. People who survive abuse and traumas, your brain spends a lot of time in fear. And then when your brain becomes hypervigilant, things that might not necessarily be super fearful, your brain will still sense it as a fearful scenario. And then comes in the emotional dysregulation where you don't have the ability to process maybe simple, challenging scenarios that might be really blown out of proportion. And that's your brain and body's inability to adapt.
That was probably one of my most awful times is like 3 years where I felt super lost, very frozen. I had the anxiety, the panic attack, and I couldn't make decisions. My mind would say, you can do this, but the action wouldn't follow.
PTSD is often thought of as a psychological disorder, and at its core root, it is a dysregulation of the autonomic nervous system. It is a physiological disorder, and so many people approach it in only a cognitive way, where they try to push cognitive therapies, and it's a physiological state. And until you train the nervous system, you could do a lot of cognitive therapy, and a lot of patients would probably say they make minimal progress, I would say. And it's because their body spends so much time in a shutdown phase that they can't make any process in therapy with just cognitive therapy alone. I attempted multiple times with just a cognitive approach alone and just didn't make the progress until I realized that my body was really stuck in a dysregulated state. And unless I start training my body to physically shift out of my hypervigilant state, I won't address the chronic myriad of inflammatory issues that exist within my body. I do believe they're reversible, but only if you train the nervous system.
I would sit in therapy doing the same thing, but my body was like, it was almost like they were working against each other.
Yeah.
My mind and my body were completely on opposite
Yes.
thought processes.
Yes.
And I couldn't, and that's that freeze where I couldn't do anything.
Yeah.
So when trauma, this is what, kind of one of the things I want to talk about is how when trauma doesn't look like trauma. So most people think of trauma sometimes as some like big event, a car accident, but sometimes trauma is rejection, years of disconnection. It lives in our body. What symptoms did you ignore that were actually signs something was wrong?
My very first symptom were gut symptoms, probably as early as in my 20s. I started developing severe reflux, food intolerances, bloating, just the inability to really process foods well. That evolved into heart palpitations, anxiety, depression. And then as a latter result, once the chronic inflammation stays for a while, then you start developing some of the autoimmune things. So for me, some autoimmune like joint complaints and stuff that I have, some thyroid complaints. I think after just spending a lot of time, not only in therapies, but a lot of reading and research, have found some other therapies and modalities that will help train the nervous system so that people can return to a good physical state and that their bodies can adapt to stress.
Do you think you realize that those symptoms that you ignored earlier on, did you know something was wrong?
I did, except for because I think I worked in the medical profession, I discounted them a lot and thought I could beat it. And I thought that sometimes in my mind, instead of owning the abuse, I blamed my job. I know I did that. Now that if I was really being honest, I think I may have said this before, but I think that I wish that on those any given office visits that I sat down with some of the medical providers that I saw, I honestly just wish that I would have had the strength to say, look, I'm in a really bad spot. I'm a healthcare provider and I have a multitude of symptoms. I'm sitting here today to try to feel better, and I'm stuck in an abusive relationship and I don't know what to do. And I know I probably feel bad as a result of all of this, but I always left that component out. And it was such a big piece. It was such a big missing piece that really would have been helpful.
Because you know something's wrong.
Yes.
So how do you now recognize trauma responses in patients who don't look like they're struggling?
Most of my patients that I see every day are patients that live with PTSD. And most of them I actually diagnose with PTSD through certain qualifying information that we go through during the visit. Most of those patients have lived with the same common physical symptoms that a lot of us live with, everything from anxiety, depression. A lot of people come to see me on polypharmacy for a long time and aren't making any progress in their journey for health. And so a lot of them turn to me on my platform to look for ways to help their nervous system reset so that they can return to work sometimes, return to a normal, healthy living where they can return to sleep and return to normal, healthy functioning. So I see them every day, and a lot of them present just like that. A lot of them even see medical providers and they will come with every diagnosis except for the PTSD diagnosis, unfortunately. So they'll come on with anxiety, depression, many of them panic attacks, bipolar. A lot of people evolve, unfortunately, even into other unfortunate diagnoses, mental health diagnoses, as a result of sitting in their current scenarios stuck for so long.
We talked about this, how PTSD is just so underdiagnosed. And so if you're working on the cognitive side, you're not really addressing it yet.
Correct. I see two things. So my two main patients are first responders. Those patients oftentimes live with PTSD and they know it many times. They just don't ever receive the diagnosis until they're ready to get help to restore their sleep. My other subset of population would be the trauma survivors, the people like you and me who sit for years in silence, who are not willing to tell anybody about their traumatic experiences in life that led them to where they are today. As survivors of trauma, we're just not willing to talk about it until we are.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. So, like, even recognizing, because I can tell you this, like, I didn't look like I was struggling from the outside, but my symptoms were panic attack, anxiety, heart palpitations, feeling like I was having a heart attack. The solution was get on some depression medication, which really wasn't dealing with really the core of what was happening inside. And again, from the outside, I think, people can make it be better than it is because we're in the shame and the guilt. You don't want to admit that that's you.
Correct. I think a lot of people, even after I did my podcast and told my story, I had a lot of people commented and said things like, I would have never known. Like, you're such a strong, assertive woman.
It's amazing the mask we wear and the strength that we look like from the outside when internally is a complete opposite.
Yes. Once you get far enough into your healing journey, you can really start doing a lot of self-reflection. And when I think back, even when I was younger in that abusive environment, when I lived there, I can see myself as two different people. I was a completely different person at work. And when I came home into that house, I feel like the minute I stepped inside, it's like you become that other person, the person that goes into survival mode.
Talking about just about PTSD because it can show up in quiet ways, right? In your gut, your energy, in your daily life. Why do you think so many people go underdiagnosed?
I think that we're just getting better and better at diagnosing people with PTSD. I really do, all the way around, from just our awareness, our ability to recognize it. When I went through training, I did not receive training. I don't remember much training in PA school on PTSD. I remember it being more of a military combat type scenario. We did not spend much time on it. And I think that it's only going to get better. Mm-hmm. And especially when people are willing to break their silence and talk about it, it's only going to get better in our ability to recognize it. I think what a lot of people might not realize is I think that we are built to be so resilient for so long. And I think our bodies can adapt only for so long. Yeah. And I think that once we live life, especially if we live life with a lot of trauma and conflict on our body, then that's what lends itself into that chronic dysregulation state of the nervous system. And it's more of a long-term process. And I think that we're able to adapt for so long. And then when our bodies are no longer able to adapt, that's when the nervous system many times does not have the ability to shift back in that parasympathetic relaxed state. It spends too much time in sympathetic overdrive. And then what people notice is that the things they were once able to handle, some of the stressors in life, maybe some of the emotional challenges, things of that nature, their focus and attention, after a while, they're not able to retain it. They're not able to bounce back. They don't have that resilience. And that's when all of the physical stuff starts to mount. And that's typically when people will finally say, look, I'm going to have to do something. I have a myriad of physical symptoms now. I have brain fog. I'm not sleeping well. And I think once those mount to a certain point and we realize our bodies are not rebounding, that's when we eventually seek help. I don't think that maybe back in the early days that people recognized personal trauma. And I think it's because Nobody speaks of personal trauma. It's too uncomfortable. We were taught not to talk or feel anything that was uncomfortable.
Yeah.
We really just were taught that. It's kind of like confirmation bias, right? You
Yeah.
were taught that for so long that it becomes the norm for your body.
I think of education from a PA standpoint or a doctor standpoint, whether, again, a lot of people associate it to the war.
They do.
Yeah.
You know what? I would imagine, and I will smile when I say this, that I hope that the curriculums change out of all of this. People feeling the freedom to speak up. It's our younger generation that's really driving this, and I love it. There has to be a movement where people understand trauma, whether it be personal trauma or if it's trauma like my first responders. The more we talk about it, the more we're open to it, and the more we're open to healing and helping people connect and survive.
Yeah.
I have to believe that.
Well, I even think just what we talk about.
Yes.
Right? It's awareness.
Yes.
That's how I feel, because I think even in our conversations, I hear the word PTSD, and I don't know if I fully thought I had it, but I definitely, speaking with you, to be honest, I had it.
It's interesting that you say that, because after we shared our personal stories, I sometimes reflect and think about you, and I think, does she live with PTSD? I can't really tell.
Yeah.
And I think of that often just because of your trauma at such a young age.
I think I went through a season for sure where it caught up to me. The two words I feel like is trauma and grief. Grief is something I want to talk about because I think that's another topic
Yes.
that we don't talk enough about, because just like PTSD, we talk about it being with war. Grief, we talk about the loss, like the death of somebody.
Yes.
Grief also is the loss of your job. You go through an identity crisis, your kids going off being an empty nester. You're grieving something.
Yeah.
Well, there's processes to it. And if you can
Yes.
understand it, then you can start working on it.
Yes.
Versus thinking it's no big deal. But I would say, talking to you, I definitely think I had it.
I think that when I think about your story, the
Yeah.
one thing that I feel like may have helped you is that you did speak up
Early.
Yes. Just not holding that on your body
Yeah.
in itself made a tremendous impact for you, I think, in the positive.
My traumatic experiences, for the most part, I've been able to talk on, is probably why I didn't have an earlier situation. But then later in life, when the divorce had happened, I was so ashamed, and I just kept so much in. I was embarrassed.
Living in silence and putting yourself into isolation is really the worst thing a person can do.
Yeah.
And that's really what puts us in that stuck phase for so long.
I want to talk about building your escape plan, because I know for me, getting out, I had a plan almost at the beginning. I have to graduate and I'm going to get out and go on. You don't need a 10-step plan. You don't need your next move. It really is just about taking action, and it's a small step, and it even can be messy. Like, I think of the small steps I was making when I moved out. It wasn't perfect and it didn't work out exactly, but it was the fact that I took the small step forward.
Yes.
So what did your first steps of survival mode actually really look like?
My first few steps, now that I can reflect back, I feel like it was a very scary time, because mine ended up kind of ending very abruptly, kind of a power play, where we had gotten to the point in our relationship where there was, constant arguments, and I had decided that I was going to move out. And when I told him that I was going to move out and that I thought it was for the best, he was not okay with those plans and wanted to make different plans and decided to move me out right that very minute. I had somewhat of a plan. It was kind of messy, kind of like what you're talking about, but it happened very quickly. I realize now, looking back, I wish that I would have just had a better connected, rational plan in my head, so that maybe I could have spared myself a little time and maybe not put myself in so much danger along the way trying to escape.
I know your story, but what gave you enough strength to start even before you were ready?
Yeah, I think for me, whenever I would be at work and I was always at my best and I was truly myself at work, there were so many times at work that I would be like, I would probably tell myself, right? We talk to ourselves all the time. I would probably tell myself, you've got this. You just need to just move out. You just need to get out of this scenario. And I would feel that. I would feel that a lot until I would return home. Once I would return home, every bit of strength I had was gone. So what I would have to do is I would have to start carving out some ideas and plans that I would put in place while I was at work when I had the strength, and then I wouldn't retract them. So I would, I would finally find the strength to get an apartment and be ready for when that time would take place. But I probably never took the scenario serious enough to have like that immediate plan in place in case I needed it. And so it was really just building strength along the way, which when I reflect back, I think if I would have connected better to people to help me, there's so much emotional dysregulation that goes on, and it's very difficult to make decisions and to rationalize your thoughts. And so that part would always get me. It would always keep me stuck. And so I think if I would have had somebody to help me rationally build a plan and have a support person along the way, that would have made a tremendous difference in probably allowing me to escape that environment much sooner.
I think it's harder the longer you live in it. So you've done the EMDR, ETT, and you've done ketamine therapy. What did each one kind of unlock for you?
So for me, EMDR and ETT were not successful for me after multiple attempts. It was frustrating for me because at the time I was thinking every trauma survivor should respond to this therapy, right? But I have found that people that live with complex PTSD, which was more of my scenario, those types of therapies were difficult for my brain because I have a lot of memory loss. And when I would try to entertain those therapies, the emotions would flood my brain. And because of the memory loss, I wouldn't really have anything. So it wouldn't unlock anything ever. It would almost irritate me because it wouldn't produce the results that I wanted it to produce. Ketamine was really the only therapy that truly unlocked my trauma. I did 6 stabilizing treatments of ketamine. I felt tremendously better after ketamine. It's not for everyone. I think if a person is interested in ketamine, they should really do their research. I probably didn't research ketamine enough, and some of my experiences with ketamine were beneficial and some of them were scary, only because my biggest fear as a survivor of abuse was death. So my ketamine experiences unfortunately took me back to what I would call near-death experiences, which were super terrorizing to my brain and for me didn't feel overly helpful. But I think a lot of it was that I wasn't prepared for the treatment. And I think that a person could do really well if they have the right team in place to assist in a pre-treatment protocol and then the treatment and then a post-treatment protocol so that the patient can receive good benefits from it.
So what do you think ketamine unlocked for you?
For me, ketamine, I did 2 series of ketamine. My first series, honestly, the way I described it is that it allowed my brain to see the sunshine for the first time in many, many years. I felt an extreme lift of the depression, the severe depression that I had lifted, and I felt joy for the first time. I have had a couple of treatments that took me to a near-death experience, which eventually led me to halt the treatment because I couldn't get past that point. So ketamine definitely unlocked my depression and it allowed me to feel the joy. It allowed me to also feel enough empowerment to want to fight harder to feel even better.
What do people get wrong about healing or getting better? Because I think a lot of times I think we all want the quick fix. So what do you think people get wrong about healing or getting better?
What people get wrong is that people approach PTSD as a psychological disorder. And again, I will go back and say that at its core, PTSD is a dysregulation of the autonomic nervous system, and it requires training of the vagus nerve. It's called vagus nerve training. It requires a retraining of your vagus nerve, which is the superhighway communicator between your brain and every other vital organ in your body. So it travels from your brainstem all the way down to to your spine, basically. And it's the super communicator. So if you train your vagus nerve to be able to adapt to stressors, then you will be able to make progress in your healing. When people only take the psychological approach, they typically don't make progress. And it's because we have so many physical manifestations that come from the dysregulation of the nervous system. Most people will make minimal progress with cognitive therapy only. And I
Yeah.
think that's the biggest misconception, is that people look for that one therapy or that one medication or that one supplement that might treat their PTSD and make it go away.
And I've been there.
I have too.
I was like, I think of how many supplements I've bought, and I would be like, this is it.
Yes. And I used to think that I could find maybe those few things, right, that might treat it. But I say it with much, much more grace now,
Yeah.
that it's a healing process. I know that I will always live with PTSD. I'm okay with that now. And I think that it's all about having the right mindset, right? And
Yeah.
it goes back to um, validating that our experiences in life truly do shape us. And even though I live with PTSD, it doesn't have to define me or my everyday. It really honestly gives me the opportunity now to live my full life at its potential, because I did acknowledge it.
I love that.
Yeah.
That's loving yourself.
It is. And it's a great feeling, because
Yeah.
I've never had it ever in my life. It's simply, truly the best gift you could ever give yourself.
One of the things I want to, before we transition out, is the gut health and our nervous system, which to me are really the two key things to a real recovery. I know I've had this experience, but if your gut is inflamed, your brain, it really can't think clearly. And if your nervous system is dysregulated, you'll keep repeating those same patterns, not because you're broken, but because your body is still kind of in that defense mode. So, what was happening to your gut and your nervous system while you were really in that silence?
Yeah, my gut probably took the biggest toll physically out of everything that I experienced. When I went and ended up having my testing done, the testing actually revealed that the lining of my gut was disintegrating. It was super scary for me at the time, but a true realization that our gut is like our second brain. We have a gut brain axis. Our brain and our gut directly communicate with each other. The longer that you stay in a high sympathetic state, the longer that your gut will evolve into things like leaky gut. You will develop food intolerances, which I did, which I had never had before. And your immune system resides in your gut. And so unfortunately, once that process takes place, then you will start developing autoimmune disorders, infections. And it's so important to physically address the gut first, I think. Everything from getting the proper testing to make sure that you know exactly what's going on in your gut. If you don't do that first, you will really miss the boat. So I would highly recommend anybody to get that special testing done, which then many times leads you down the path of taking certain things, maybe digestive enzymes, probiotics, prebiotics. Sometimes people have to treat toxicities that reside within their gut. And many times, once you calm the gut down with nutraceuticals, certain supplements to help, and it helps repair the lining of the gut, then what you'll find is that a lot of your other things will start to dissipate. So some of the autoimmune things will dissipate, and you can actually reverse them. And so really focusing on your gut health, repairing your gut, eliminating foods that maybe you've had and developed sensitivities to over time. So actually getting those tests done and eliminating those foods will repair your gut. Once you repair your gut, then your immune system follows, and then your emotional regulation follows. Once you start repairing those processes and strengthening your nervous system, then your body's ability to adapt and become more in an adaptive state for your nervous system, then everything tends to align. And so I think a lot of people can get not only better, but improve your health
Yeah.
if you will follow those steps.
When I was going through, which we talked about, like my panic attacks and the anxiety, I had done all my labs. So I had the leaky gut. gluten, dairy, soy, all these allergies. And for 90 days, I had one on, a PA, just like you had basically put me on a 90-day program. At our age, we have inflammation. Laying down, I would have like the pain in my hips. I will tell you, in 90 days, every ounce of pain that I had in my body was gone.
I believe it.
Like 100% was by eliminating all of the foods that I needed to based on
If people would repair their gut
Yeah.
and restore their sleep and
Yeah.
then also follow good nutritional
Yeah.
guidelines, boy, the potential for your health to be amazing is totally there. A
Was
lot of people
life-changing for
don't
me.
realize that
Yeah.
it's really some of the simple things. I even do that with my I do some part-time work and I do some functional medicine and hormone replacement therapy. And with my patients on that platform, we talk a lot about just simple techniques that can really propel you into that next phase of your life. Everything from time restricted eating to certain diets, eating at certain times of the day. There's certain nutritional foods and functional foods that you can put into your daily regimen that can really make an impactful difference that a lot of people just don't realize. Getting up in the morning and taking a walk within 30 minutes of the sun rising will help reset your master clock in your brain and will help any trauma survivor start to modulate the nervous system.
Why do you think gut health is one of the most ignored but essential parts of emotional recovery?
I think that people often think that they can treat their symptoms with medications and that will heal the emotional part of their injury. What they fail to realize is that our neurotransmitters are really produced out of our gut. So our dopamine, our norepinephrine, our serotonin is all produced out of the gut. If we don't have a healthy gut, our gut doesn't even produce those neurotransmitters. And so our emotional health is not even possible. And so it's so important to repair your gut health so that you can naturally shift your body back into more of an emotional regulation state.
Can you explain what nervous system regulation really means and why it matters for healing?
Yes. Again, I will go back and say that PTSD at its core is a dysregulation of the nervous system. And over time, when the nervous system spends an enormous amount of time in sympathetic overdrive, it loses its ability to shift back into a rest and relaxation state. When the body does not shift back, then the body doesn't have the ability to repair itself cellularly. It doesn't have the ability to withstand stressors and resilience. And over time, it will generally result in kind of total collapse. And most people will end up spending most of their time in what I call a dorsal vagal response, where most of them are in a freeze or shutdown, where they're in a stuck mode, or they will oscillate back and forth between hypervigilance in a sympathetic overdrive to that dorsal drive where they're in a shutdown mode and they oscillate back and forth between the two. And so strengthening and retraining the nervous system is absolutely essential to heal the body.
What do you tell people who feel like they're doing everything right, but still feel like they're anxious, they're exhausted, and they're stuck?
I think that most people don't probably look at it at its core value. Most people attack PTSD maybe in compartments and they try to maybe do a multifaceted like intervention type approach that doesn't necessarily work unless you really take the wholehearted approach of really addressing the nervous system as a whole.
Yeah, kind of going back to the whole gut, starting there.
Absolutely.
And then obviously working to the nervous system. What are 2 to 3 small, let's call it real things people can do today to support their nervous system and start feeling better?
Gosh, I think the first thing that a person could do is get the proper sleep. I think a lot of people really underestimate the value of sleep. I know I did for a very long time. And I think what people don't realize is that we go through 3 phases of sleep at night that does a lot of cellular and mitochondrial repair for our body. And when we don't get that sleep, our body loses out on those efforts over time that accumulates. So I think sleep probably is top priority along with nutrition. I think nutrition and gut health are way overlooked. I think people oftentimes look for more of a quick fix versus how do I strengthen my body so that I can become resilient and overcome this. That's the mindset you really have to have. You have to want to train your body to go out of its comfortable zone and become stronger so that you can become more resilient, so that you can adapt to things in life. Again, if a person says, I'm always stuck and I'm always have racing thoughts and depression and anxiety and I can't get out of that, they are not taking the time to mindfully put their body in a parasympathetic state to train it to come back down into a calm state. Music and sound is amazing in healing trauma because it actually engages in the auditory and has a direct impact in the brainstem. Like we get up every day, right? And we kind of decide, are we going to do all the right things today, like hydrate our body and mindful eating and just good practices for our emotional health. There's lots of simple things we can do as an individual to really make a direct impact on our nervous system. And a lot of people just don't realize it.
That's the power, of the gut health and then into your nervous system.
Absolutely. If you truly do have a lot of physical symptoms, a lot of medical issues, address them to the core. Get those tests done. It makes a big difference. Implement the dietary changes, start working on your sleep, and then start training your nervous system, because a lot of people, that's why they walk around with such emotional dysregulation and fatigue all the time, is because their body is stuck in sympathetic overdrive and it's fatigued out.
So what would you say would be, again, I think of trauma, whether it's PTSD or just trauma, what would you say would be from a nervous system? Now we talk about the gut part of it, but what would you say would be a couple things you could do to get your nervous system, it starts with the gut, right? So until you get your gut under control, you can't get your nervous system where it needs to go. But once you have your gut, then how would you then work on your nervous system?
I would work on getting movement back. A lot of people stop exercising and become pretty, I would say, sedentary in their life once a lot of this has taken place because they don't feel good. They have chronic pain. And I think that if you get some mindful movement back into your life, it makes a big difference. I think that when you're doing some of the nervous system training, even simple things, developing a regimented sleep regimen at night makes a huge difference on your nervous system. A lot of people don't realize that, but even developing just a good regimen of sleep, right down to the time that you sleep, to your sleep habit. So when I put my patients through sleep training, a lot of them, we talk about that the environment has to be cold and dark at night. They can't turn on lights and elicit any light response to their retina because it tries to reset the master clock. So there's a lot of those little things that you can do every day. And sleep and nutrition are the two biggest things you can do, along with just mindful movement, getting your body out into nature. I tell a lot of my patients that live with insomnia from PTSD that they have to kind of retrain themselves. And so a lot of them have to set alarm clocks, get up in the morning and take a walk within 30 minutes of the sun rising. And it helps their body retrain their nervous system, kind of resets their master clock, sets everything in motion so that the nervous system, you're training it to start working in a more parasympathetic state right out of the gates, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
And so a lot of it is, and there's lots of resources out there that we didn't always have access to. But I think that's the other great thing that I love about, about podcasts and everything that we have access to on the internet, is that can find a lot of good resources to help you learn some of these techniques so that you can put them into your practice. Because again, it's about every day getting up and implementing these so that you can train your nervous system every day to start functioning the way that you want it to function. It's very much like you said, eliminating the foods that don't work for you anymore. It's about hydration. It's about sleep. a lot of it is nutraceuticals and finding the supplements that you need to replenish your body of the vitamins and minerals and things that it has not been able to absorb from the gut for so long. So there's lots of things that a person can do every day to really physically start retraining and resetting your nervous system to adapt and be more resilient.
Do you want to share the book before we close? Do you want to share a book
Yes,
that
yes,
you're reading? Because
yes.
I think we talk about not only the gut, but I know you had mentioned
The Vagus Nerve Healing Bible, and I'm reading it now so that I can train my nervous system. It's probably been the missing link for me for a long time. I kind of discovered it just through a lot of my research. And I had looked for quite some time into vagus nerve. There's actually some modalities out there that can reset the vagus nerve, chemical modalities, and I had even looked into those. So for me now, it's just amazing to know that I have something here that I can implement every day into my life, knowing that I'm in charge of training my nervous system now, and I can essentially rewire it and reset it so that my body doesn't have to spend any more time in a survival mode. It's not a great feeling. And I would tell anybody you don't have to live there anymore. You really don't.
So again, I just want to reiterate, somebody would need to work on their gut first and then their nervous system.
Yes.
And I stress that because I don't want somebody to pick up a book and do that and think you don't. The gut is number one and the nervous system is number two. But I looked at the book. So it was a 28-day plan. Everyone needs how-tos.
Yes. And I am literally just starting it.
Yeah.
So I'll be excited to follow up with you because obviously it's the results, right? The results that you get from it will be the tell all. And so I'll be excited for that.
Yeah. I've obviously got to do part 1 and part 2. And I love this because part 2 to me is more, so you've been living with this and it's how do we break the silence and how do you kind of get out? But then the impacts of that trauma through the gut and the nervous system that you don't have to live with forever. Once you can acknowledge the trauma and the pain that you've went through, then you can work on your gut and then ultimately get you out of that state of stuck and that frozen state with your nervous system and live an amazing life after that. So you're allowed to change. You can have more in life and you can do that without an apology.
Absolutely.
What does healing feel like for you today? Not perfectly, but practically.
Yeah. For me, it's finding the joy in healing because for a long time it was painful. And before it was painful, it was impossible. And so once you get to that point, I think where you finally find the joy in healing. And for me, that's the greatest feeling for me. And to be able to help others heal. I want people to see that you don't have to sit back and wait for somebody to come rescue you. You can take charge of this yourself. And I think everybody sees a glimpse of that. Maybe even when they're stuck, they see that glimpse of themselves that does have that strength or maybe had that strength at one time, because I know I felt it. I know I felt glimpses of it. And I would say to anybody, rescue yourself. We're not guaranteed any given day. We really aren't. And so I think to be able to help people break free of their own imprisonment and feel the joy in life, it's pretty amazing.
Yeah. I always say no one's coming to save you.
They're not.
Save yourself.
You do.
What chapter are you writing now and how is it different from who you used to be?
Oh, wow. For me, I really just want to live life with joy. I spent so much of my time living every day just to get through the day and survive. And so for me, it's just about living with joy and living with the freedom to make whatever choice I want to make in life. I really want to help other people reach their full potential in life. And so if I can help along this way, I've been in medicine for over 20 years. I truly love what I do. I know I was built for this, and it is my true passion now every day to get up and help people that live with PTSD. It really does bring a lot of joy and peace to my heart.
And you have self-love. That would be your
I do have self-love.
That would be a big, just as you had said earlier, I think self-love is a new part of your chapter that you did not have for most
I
of
did
your
not
life.
have that in the beginning.
Yeah.
It's a big piece.
Well, I was like that.
It's one of the most important pieces.
I wanted to recognize that just in case you forgot.
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you.
What's your message to the person who feels like it's too late or too hard and really not worth trying?
Call me. I just think that help is really honestly it's just a phone call away or a text away. There's so many support groups now out there available for people. And I think a lot of it is just speaking up and asking for it. And even if you don't know how, even if it's messy, it's really all you have to do.
I love that.
Yeah.
You're not stuck because you're broken. You're stuck because your body's been in survival mode for too long. And the second you start listening to it, everything changes. I hope this episode gave you a deeper understanding of your symptoms, your patterns, and your healing. Because real recovery isn't just emotional, it's physical, it's gut-based, it's nervous system deep. Until next time, keep rewriting your story, one chapter at a time.